So I'm a professor at Mount Royal University, and my specialty began with primatology, as I told you, non-human primates, and has sort of blossomed into a field of study that I really didn't want to get into, but found myself a participant in. And so my research for the last 5 years has been very much about parental alienation. So I want to go back as an anthropologist to what I see as the very beginning, because I think in order to understand this problem, we have to understand its root cause. And so if we go back in time till about 10,000 years ago, everybody lived as a hunter-gatherer. So all of us lived in small community bands where we all gathered most of our food and did a little bit of hunting on the side, and we cooperated in every way possible. So there was not a distinction in value between the two sexes. There was not a distinction in value between those of high status and those of low status, and everybody cooperated in parenting as well. And so what I'd like to say, first of all, is that both parents is the norm. And this is human nature, and it has always been human nature. And even since 10,000 years ago, when most of us moved into a very different way of life because of farming, we still maintained a both-parent scenario with our children. And it has only been in the last few hundred years, which is a nanosecond when we're talking about history, that we've started to see this big distinction between values of people. And so when we're talking about parenting, it is very unusual, and I would say unnatural, to think of one parent as being more important than the other. So the bottom line is that kids need both parents. And so the UN Convention of the Child in 1989, which was ratified in Canada in 91, stated very clearly that best interests of the child will be the priority in decisions made in all regards where children are involved. And today we have a Family Law Act and a Divorce Act, both of which stipulate clearly that the priority in making decisions about children is what's in the best interest of the child. So I want to read to you quickly Section 18.1 in the Family Law Act of Alberta, which says, "In all proceedings under this part, except proceedings under Section 20, the court shall take into consideration only the best interests of the child." Only the best interests of the child. Best interest equals two parents and a positive, nurturing environment. Following separation and divorce, kids also need both parents. Why would that change? And so it is very interesting to me that we have decided that for some reason, post-divorce, both parents are no longer equally important. And so even though the marriage has broken down between the parents, why is it that the marriage breaks down between the children and the parents? Because I'm pretty sure that when you have a child, you are now married to that child for its life. And based on love and genetics and adoption rules and all kinds of things. And so this is a very interesting situation that we're finding ourselves in. And when the legal system gets involved, without that kind of a background on what is normal and natural, then we see chaos ensue, and that's exactly what we're living with today. And so there is a researcher named Linda Nielsen in the States, and she does some research on meta-analysis of social studies, various research studies that are all peer-reviewed and so therefore academic and really good solid data. And she's looked at, what is happening after divorce and why is it not a default decision that kids share time equally with both parents? Why is this so difficult? Is it because maybe shared parenting is not as useful? And so she looked at 111 peer-reviewed studies, and she found that every single one of them concluded that shared parenting, which by the way means 35% with each parent at least, equal parenting meaning 50-50, because there are occasions when one parent cannot do the 50-50. And in all those 111 studies, she found that the conclusion was the same, that shared or equal parenting is the best outcome for a child. Then she looked at 54 peer-reviewed studies, and she was looking at reasons why shared parenting is so beneficial. Because one of the things that I've heard in court a lot is that, in fact, the kids are better off with one parent because there's more stability. And so by looking at this meta-analysis, and there are a lot of points here, Linda came up with 11, actually. And maybe the most important one is the first one, that in all regards, kids in shared parenting situations do much better in the long term, even into adulthood, than kids that are put in a position where one parent is valued much higher than the other. So maybe you want to have a look at some of those. These are all contentious points, you know, that, for instance, overnights of infants and toddlers should not happen because these poor infants and toddlers will be, they will not be appropriately bonded to their mothers because they're spending so much time with their fathers. And these studies are showing that that does not weaken the bond with either parent, and in fact strengthens that bond equally with both parents. And so even in that case, which I think is a fairly radical one, where you have newborns and very young children, even in that case, shared and preferably equal parenting is the best. The benefit outweighs any conflict between the parents' effects. So another comment that is made a lot is that, well, the parents are high conflict and therefore it's better to choose one home for the kids and take that other parent away so that you can lessen the conflict between those parents. And it turns out, even in those cases where there's high conflict, those children are better off spending time with each parent, even when they know those two parents hate each other. Sad but true. So it's still indicated as the best situation for the kids. The income of the parents is irrelevant. So if one parent doesn't have as much money as the other, oh well, the kids are still just as well off with either parent. And that if they have low income or if they have high income, that is also irrelevant to the outcome for kids. So the idea of shared and equal parenting transcends all socioeconomic levels. What else? Yeah, successful shared parenting is not related to lower conflict. So it doesn't mean that a successful shared parenting relationship must be a co-parenting relationship. Oftentimes the parents are unable to co-parent. And so in that case, really the communication between the parents has to be treated as a business arrangement, that they discuss what they need to about the kids in a very sort of almost a third person kind of voice to take the emotion away. And almost in every case, one parent will initially oppose shared parenting. And we know why that is, because there's money involved. And so when one parent will benefit from having the children more, that parent is the one that is most likely to say that they oppose shared parenting. And so when the conflict, which I mentioned earlier, but when the conflict is even physical, so when we're talking about physical abuse between the parents, and the kids have even witnessed that abuse, kids still do better with shared parenting. So, for the life of me, I can't think of a situation in which children are better off with only one parent. Keeping in mind that we're talking about loving, positive, capable parents on both sides. This is not about abuse. This is not about one parent being neglectful or dealing with addiction issues or any of those other complications. And so the strong relationships with both parents offsets the high parental conflict and the poor co-parenting. And shared parenting relationships are most often parallel. So I think you probably all know what parallel parenting is, but that's that business relationship I was talking about, as opposed to co-parenting where you can both go to, the parent-teacher interviews together, and you can have dinners together on birthdays. That's really great if it works, but it usually doesn't, unfortunately. And so I want to talk now about parental alienation itself and what this even is about. So in the absence of neglect or abuse, This is one parent's campaign to destroy the relationship of their children with the other parent. This happens in a number of ways. There are all kinds of alienation tactics that are carried out either intentionally or not by the alienator towards the targeted parent, usually witnessed by the children, so that the children are constantly getting a vibe that one parent is capable and competent and the other one is not. The goal is to destroy the relationship between the kids and the targeted parent. And alienators will not stop until they have achieved that goal, sadly. So some of the points that are made by an alienator, or some of the behaviors they will engage in, involve a fabrication of a false reality. So that they will say things to the children like, your dad is a drunk. Your dad cheated on me and therefore he is untrustworthy. Your mom is a whore. Your mom is doesn't care about you. And so it goes. And so there is this constant repetitive theme that one parent is not capable. Non-custodial parents are at the whim of the custodial parent. So as the targeted parent, you are more likely to do what the custodial parent asks you to do, even when it's inappropriate, because you are so scared that you're going to lose whatever relationship is left with your child. And so, in fact, it can sometimes push the non-custodial, targeted parent into a position where they may be engaging in, for instance, too much leniency. And then that is later held against them because they will be called weak. Well, you're a weak dad. Or you're a useless mom because you're not a disciplinarian. And yet the targeted parent, should they use discipline, is going to hear about that probably from the opposing party's lawyer in no time. And this is where we get a lot of the emergency protection orders and so on that happen quite frequently. I wanted to mention too the terms that are often confused with alienation or brought in an inappropriate way. And so the words are estrangement and enmeshment. So the word enmeshment is a legal term that is used to denote a parent who has inappropriately close ties to his or her children. And this is a tactic that is used commonly by alienators for the purpose of showing that that parent, the alienator, is the only important, in fact, the only parent. And the other person is just an irritant at best and dangerous at worst. And that's enmeshment. And so that's something that counselors, therapists need to know about and they need to watch for, so that they're aware that when they hear of a parent talking about how they pick up that child every single day from school and they text that child several times and they're always going on every single field trip, and they're over controlling. Sometimes we call them helicopter parents these days, that hover around that child. That is actually very inappropriate, and it is also bolstering the alienation and the child's feelings that only that one parent can be trusted. The term estrangement is where the deteriorated relationship between a child and his or her parents is warranted. And so estrangement happens when one parent, say, is abusive. And that parent should not have a relationship with that child. And so whether there has been intervention by the courts or mental health professionals or not, the fact is that estrangement is warranted and has evidence backing it. And so this also has to be established, because if a child goes to a therapy session and says, I hate my dad or I hate my mom, then first we need to rule out estrangement, because the very definition of parental alienation is based on both parents being loving and capable with a positive relationship. So enmeshment, yes, is a very big part of parental alienation. So the causes of parental alienation are 3. And there may be more, but I've kind of whittled it down into what I think are the big 3. And the biggest one is mental illness, especially in the form of narcissism. So personality disorders, now usually called narcissism, and I'm no psychologist, so Dan, for instance, you would know much more about this than I do. There's a lot of literature and great research coming out now suggesting that in a lot of cases, perhaps the majority, perhaps even all of them, mental illness is a big driver of parental alienation. And when there is an underlying personality disorder, then to ask for mediation or open communication with the parents is an absolutely ridiculous directive. So the second reason why alienators alienate is money. And so, as we know, custody and child support are dependent on how much time a child spends in the care of one parent or the other. So in shared parenting, and I'm going to call on my experience from my first marriage here, where the kids went back and forth 50-50 time, then the way we worked it out, and we went through collaborative law, so we each had a lawyer and we sat in one room, and it was a one meeting thing. I mean, it was great. It cost us each $3,000, but that was the end. And so then what we did is we were both working full time. We were each going to have the children half time. So we added up our assets as a family. And then we basically each got half of that. And then my ex paid child support based on the difference in our income at the time. So he was making about 70% more than I was making at that time. But we even had it written into our separation agreement that as my income increased, then his support would go down. There was no spousal support. We're just talking about the child support. And so within about 4 years, then there was no payment at all. And his payments were very small all the time. I think it was about $300 that he was required to pay me. The reason was because I had just come out of grad school, and while I had been in grad school for too many years, I had some grants, but really our household was paying the lion's share of the cost of my being in grad school, which really means my husband, because he was working full time. So again, this seems like it should be kind of a no-brainer. And if that was the case and default shared parenting, equal parenting was the norm, it would be a simple calculation and probably a one-meeting event instead of it being carried on over years and years. So money, and then finally revenge. And revenge sometimes gets overlooked, but it is so huge that it is often overlapping the money incentive and the mental illness factor in why an alienator behaves in such a way. But revenge can occur because that ex, the alienator, really hates the other person. You know, they had a terrible marriage, that they don't like that person. And so they feel that their main goal is to try to pay back that person by whatever means it takes in order to ruin their life. So that one, as I said earlier, should be completely separate from the children. You know, if the parents hate each other, that's fine, should have nothing to do with the kids, and the kids should never hear about it. But, you know, in parental alienation, I also find revenge is used in cases where the parents separate and they actually don't hate each other, but then one of those parents gets a new relationship. And as soon as they get a new relationship, now the ex, who was kind of cooperative in the beginning, now decides she hates her ex or he hates his ex. And now the revenge gets ramped up and becomes the priority because of that new possible step-parent in the child's life. So in a healthy divorce, if there's such a thing, I think that the new parent or the new relationship could be seen as a healthy development. You know, the person is moving on. This is an extra responsible adult in the child's life. Now that child has 3 parents or 4 parents. The step-parent's always taking a back seat, of course, to the primary relationship of the biological parents or the adoptive parents. But instead it's seen as just another reason to alienate to an even more extreme level. So now the effect of alienation on the child, in psychological terms, there are now 3 identified areas where children are affected, and this can be traced and research to the DSM-5, which is the directory of mental illnesses. And so this is, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. This stuff is already in the DSM-5. So in other words, therapists already know about these dysfunctions. And so the 3 dysfunctions that have been isolated by researchers such as Craig Childress in the States, he's doing a lot of work on this, is attachment system suppression. So this is where the child is interrupted in his or her normal ability to attach appropriately to both parent figures. Instead, that child is prevented from doing so. Secondly, there is personality disorder pathology in the child. So the child shows narcissistic traits, him or herself, and become very self-focused to the detriment of other relationships. And the delusional psychiatric pathology in the child, which is an encapsulated persecution complex. So they feel that they have a higher level of status in the relationship between the parents than is appropriate for a child to have. They also feel that one parent is evil and one parent is good, and that it's up to the child to sort that out and to make appropriate decisions. And so the child feels that they are being, mismanaged by the targeted parent, and they are doing their best to support the alienator. So they're put in a position which is really a no-win for the child. So the outcomes on the child, what are we actually going to see, those of us who are not therapists? How are we going to see the behaviors manifest in the child? Well, we're going to see all kinds of things. The biggest thing that I saw with my 3 stepdaughters from my second marriage was flat emotionality. So those girls did not really react to anything. And they were never very happy, and they were never very sad. They just kind of were there. And so when we were together, I think it was 3 times in 10 years, those 3 girls with my 2 kids would perhaps be excited about something. And his 3 really wouldn't care, Or if something really awful happened, their grandfather died, and they just kind of announced it to us that, Grandpa died, so we have to go to Vancouver. And my kids, I think, were more sad about that, because they just thought, that must be so awful. I can't imagine losing my grandpa. So you see that flat emotionality. They're unambiguous in their position about the targeted parent. So when asked, do you see your dad? And they say no. Then you say, well, do you wish you could see your dad? No, I hate my dad. He's a, blank blank. I don't want anything to do with him. If I ever see him again, I want to punch him in the face. I want to shoot my dad. I hate my mother. Those kinds of things, I'm not exaggerating, those are the kinds of things, and some of you will have heard that sort of language as well. Kids who, interestingly enough, I think, kids who are being abused by a parent don't behave that way. Kids that are being abused by a parent, when they're asked to speak about that parent, they will be quite hesitant to say anything. They will try to work it so that they're not being too black and white about their opinions, because they're used to trying to reduce conflict. And so the last thing they want to do is ramp it up. And so it is pretty clear when you're talking to a child whether they are in fact being alienated enough. When I was at the International Shared Parenting Conference a few months ago in Boston, there were some really great stats that came out from a study that was done comparing children and how they feel about both their parents. And those children came from 3 different backgrounds. In one case, the parents were quite capable, both of them, and they lived together. And the kids reported that each of their parents was, they're okay. They're sort of like decent parents, but they're not wonderful. And then they asked the kids that came from abusive families where they were known and there was evidence and there had been intervention and so on. They asked the kids about each of their parents then. And the kids said, the parent who was the abuser was actually rated much higher than you would think. That abuser you would think would be rated as 0, like the most horrible parent ever. But instead, curiously, the abuser was rated not high, but almost at the height of the parents the parents that were of the kids from the intact, healthy background. And then when they interviewed kids of alienation cases, those kids rated the alienator as almost 100% perfect. And the targeted parent was the lowest of all three cases, and rated about a 20 out of 100. And so that parent was, barely even worth living in the child's view. And so just that huge disparity between mom and dad from the perception of the child is quite demonstrative by itself. So what happens to kids with this sort of situation when they're dealing with alienation over time? Well, we call them PAS kids. And so this is was a slide of an adult child of PAS. So this person perhaps would have grown up in a household of alienation and lost relationship with either his mom or his dad. But these kids, when we call them PAS kids, it means that they have developed a syndrome, which means that they take the dysfunction into adulthood. And so as children, I talked a little bit about some of the behaviors that they will experience, but these things, even in childhood, but carried into adulthood, are behaviors like anxiety and depression and feelings of low self-worth, truancy in school, so low educational attainment in adulthood, unemployment, chronic unemployment, inability to get along with others, and bankruptcy, of course, because we tend to see perpetuation of the cycle. So a person who is alienated as a child often will be attracted to a future alienator in adulthood. And this is very concerning. And so these adult children will sometimes be attracted to the personality of control that they see in another person, and they're not doing it consciously. That's what they know best. And so they look for that. And of course, then they end up becoming alienated from their own children a generation later. Outcomes on the targeted parent can be the same then as on the child. So the targeted parent is dealing with anxiety and depression, chronic unemployment, and added to that perhaps bankruptcy, homelessness, suicide, because people who were making decent incomes before and may be quite educated even are rendered penniless because of their involvements with the courts. And so I thought I would just quickly go over the original study that I did with interviewing people who were alienated parents, targeted parents. And so there were 28 of them and living in Alberta and BC. And we had to spend a lot of time screening them, first of all, and looked at all the court documents to make sure that they were verified and that this was an actual alienation case. And so what we found, my study was called Kids Come Last. And it was all about legal involvement. And so I was wanting to know what happens when targeted parents have no other course of action left to them but to go for legal help. They've tried talking to the alienator. They've tried to go to mediation. They've tried to cater to the alienator. They've sort of blurred their own boundaries and value systems to just keep the conflict level low. And if anything, it's made the problem worse. So what do? They go and hire a lawyer, which makes sense. That's what family law is supposed to be for. And instead, what we found at the end of our analysis was really four main points. And the overwhelming ones were that, invoking legal involvement makes the alienation worse. So rather than decreasing the level of parental alienation, this is going to make it worse. So when I speak to lawyers, they don't want to hear this, but they know perfectly well it's true. And so the very reason you went for help is going to work against you. Secondly, alienated parents are uncooperative in any potential resolution initiatives. for the mental illness reason that I mentioned earlier, and perhaps money as well, and revenge, all of them. But they are incapable, I would say, of cooperating. And so this will not work for judges to say, well, let's work this out. Or I've seen in court, two parents are told by the judge to go in the back room and hammer out a parenting plan and then come back for the judge's approval. Well, they do that. They go in the back room and they hammer out their parenting plan and they come back and the judge says great and feels good about him or herself, sign off on the parenting plan or parenting order, which then is completely ignored the minute they walk out of the courtroom. So in our case, with my husband and I, we had 5 court orders. All of them ruled in Dad's favor and should have provided social supports and intervention and more access time and all kinds of things, none of which ever happened. So legal professionals are maximizing their profits by prolonging these cases. And they are paid in hourly billable hours. It's all about billable hours. And so it's like the Netflix series Suits. You know, it's all about the billable hours. And so really, in order to move up in status in your law firm, then you bring more money into the company. You don't resolve more cases or help more children. And finally, legal and non-legal court-directed professionals are ill-equipped to manage alienation cases. And so when I started this study in 2012, you know, maybe we could even say, well, it's sort of a new field. We're not too sure what parental alienation is. We need to hammer out more specifics. But you know what? It was done then. It was already done. I just didn't know it until I started looking through the literature. And since that time, there has been an explosion of research in this area. And so there is no excuse for any professional to say, oh, I didn't know. And thanks to the work of such people like Craig Childress, we now have actual tools in the DSM pointing to psychological abuse of children. And so there should be already the tools in order to fix the problem. Sorry, we went right to the end there. Not that it really matters. And so the 4 barriers to resolution. I'm sorry, I need to go back one. So asking in a courtroom for a judge or a lawyer to say, well, we're going to send these kids off for therapy or for psychological assessments or whatever they do may not work because the actual professionals are ill-equipped to manage the case in the first place. And I have heard of so many groups that profess to be experts in parental alienation. And yet then even just on the phone, when I ask them questions, they don't have any idea what we're even talking about. And so that's really dangerous, I think, because then when victims are being sent there, children and adults alike, then that professional doesn't even know where to start. And for instance, they're taking the child's word for it. When the child walks in at 12 years old and says, I hate my dad, then the therapist writes down, dad is bad, or dad is dangerous, instead of finding out where that might be coming from. And so those were basically the findings of the study. And so at the end here, I just want to talk about resolution and what can be done. And really, I think there are 2 main points that have to happen. They're already happening in 5 states, and there are 2 more states, Florida, and what's the other one that's pending right now? I've got it here somewhere. But every year in the states, more of the states are moving to default shared, preferably equal parenting. Minnesota and Florida are pending, and so hopefully they will push through default shared / equal parenting as well. So that's the first thing that has to happen, that right from the beginning, there should be not just an assumption, but a directive that this is going to be equal parenting, unless there are circumstances where it has to become shared parenting instead. So 50-50, unless there's another reason. And this is assuming, again, that both parents are capable and positive and loving people. And so that should happen. However, you have to add to that, if there is any potential for high conflict, then either parent or an involved party, and that could be a therapist, but it also could be a grandparent or a sibling. If anybody reports that, you know what, I think this might be a high conflict situation, right away, then there is sort of a swooping in of social services that will intervene from the start. They will have psychological assessments done of both parents and the children. They will make sure that there is monitoring done of the parenting to make sure it actually happens. If it doesn't happen, there will be real penalties with enforcement, which includes jail time. Not just, well, this might happen if the parent doesn't abide by the court order. Instead, it will happen automatically. So in cases where a court order is not followed, the way the Family Law Act reads right now, it is up to the targeted parent to then go back to court, get yet another court order for enforcement, which costs them more money and time as well, and time is critical when you're talking about children. And on top of that, when they get that court order, it will be ignored as well. And even if it's not ignored, for instance, if you get police enforcement, when the police show up at the house to get the children to take them to dad's or mom's, then the children will perceive that as more ammunition against the targeted parent. You know, now you've got the police after us, and it will be used by the alienator. So that default shared parenting, which is adequately enforced and timely and immediate, has to happen, and also the reporting of any potential high conflict situation. And we know that high conflict occurs in about 13% of separations, and it could be much higher. I suspect it is. And high conflict really means anything. It just means that the two are not able to sit down in a collaborative way and sort out parenting in the best interests of the children. So that's what all I have to say. Thanks, and let's open it up and talk about whatever you'd like to, if I can be helpful, or if you have things you'd like to share. Mm-hmm.
Out of all of your studies, did anyone ever come to some type of even basic resolution where the targeted parent got time with the child?
You know what? I would say one case that I can think of my study. I know of another case too. Both were dads who were the targeted parents. In the one case, and this is a dad in Edmonton, when he stopped using lawyers and he self-represented, he finally got custody of his son. So the alienation had started at their separation when his son was 2. And by the time he got full custody, the child was 7. So 5 years out of that child's life, which you can't get those years back, and how much damage is done. The good news was that finally the child went with dad, and dad realizes the value of 2 parents. So now the child still does see mom, but supervised visits, with the goal being that if she actually abides by the rules of supervised visits and she is in treatment and counseling in order to deal with her own issues, then she will have more time with the child and she can be more of an equal parent. And so, that one has actually turned out fairly well, although it's still sad that it had to revert to another sole custody situation, but the mom is mentally ill, so there has to be intervention. And the other case was last year where a firefighter in Calgary was deemed to be an abusive father, which he certainly is not, and there was absolutely no evidence. And so the mother had gotten an emergency protection order, which is very easy to do. And she had gone to an emergency shelter, which is also very easy to do. And you don't have to have any evidence. And so when the evidence is in place, those organizations are incredibly important. And I don't think any of us would dispute that. But the fact that you need no evidence, no verification that this is actually even a problem, means that once you've got that EPO in hand, or you say you're living in a shelter, I'm not sure, but I don't think any judge is going to allow for a shared or equal parenting situation. So until you can get that removed, you're in big trouble as a parent. And the children suffer every time, you know, first and foremost.
I think one of the other things that we've run into, as much as the courts say it's all about the kids and there should be shared parenting and that's what we all believe in, yet the courts basically believe it should be one or the other. Like shared parenting doesn't exist in the court system, and yeah, it's just one of those things that we gotta get over. The other part that you've mentioned is narcissism. Is that even, as far as like psychological aspect, is that deemed as being a mental illness now? Because you're saying, you know, one parent had, you know, was mentally ill and therefore, but I think a lot of us that go through parent alienation, we can sum up that pretty easily. Our other halves or our past halves are narcissistic to some degree or full-born, and yet have never come across where it's being deemed that as being a mental illness. It's like, yeah, so.
Well, diagnosed by a clinical person, a qualified person, then.
Well, how do you ever get them diagnosed, right? I mean,
Well, they'd have
masters
to have some type of assessment, a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But if diagnosed, then it's a very serious mental disorder on the scale of a personality disorder, and those are pretty much the worst cluster you can have. One of the personality disorders, and narcissistic personality disorder is one of them. So.
Well, I found that basically you can bring that up to a judge, and the judge doesn't understand it, obviously, because that's not their forte, right? And they say, well, you got to go to family services, and family services doesn't understand it to be a mental illness, so it's just, right? So we go back into that. Again, yes. There's parents out there that are fighting and trying to get rid of that parent alienation and trying to do what's best for the kids. And yet our whole system looks at it and goes, we don't understand it.
Yeah, what we hear sometimes in our men's groups is that the language is used loosely. Mm-hmm. Right? So so-and-so's abusive, so-and-so's a narcissist, so-and-so's. And then other people within the system, it's not even a clinical diagnosis, start acting as if. And then that ruins the whole process, right? Mm-hmm. And harms, you know, dads, moms, kids, and families, right? Yeah. Just with loose language.
Yeah. And so if there were psychological assessments or psychiatric assessments in these cases of high conflict, hopefully that would identify some of these people early on. But as you said, that's not useful unless those practitioners are actually knowledgeable about how to do those and how to interpret those. And so that work of Craig Childress in the States, that's one of his areas that he's saying, you know, professionals have to be schooled in how to not just do the assessment, but how to interpret the assessment as well before any decisions are made about parenting. And if there isn't a personality disorder, then it probably needs to be treated as criminal behavior. You know, it's probably that, I don't know if I could say simple, but it's kind of one or the other. You know, so if you can eliminate the possibility of a personality disorder, then why would a parent prevent a relationship with the other parent? It seems to me that you don't love your children. And so I can't imagine this, you know, you might hate your ex-partner, but I don't think you want anything but the best for your child if you are a healthy parent and you actually love your child. So if you're not providing that relationship, then I think it's pretty clear either there's something wrong with you or there is something wrong with you. Whether you call it a personality disorder or you're making money from it or whatever, it is certainly not in the child's best interest.
Sure, if you trigger the revenge condition, right, and someone's acting vengeful and with revenge against their partner to alienate them, then that must trigger, or I would think, or it should trigger, we need to look into this more deeply as to whether or not this person's got a problem.
Mm-hmm. So is there clinical words or legal words that are accepted and trigger our system to recognize it? Like we have that fallacy of, well, we're using the words loosely. Well, if we use the words loosely in our, narcissistic behavior, And now it's become basically the professions or the judges and that are looking at it going like, well, that's just, it's not holding any worth or any
They're
value.
not recognizing it.
Right? So
You know, one of the big problems is that lawyers and judges are pretending to be psychologists and psychiatrists. And that is absolutely mind-boggling, that I'm not either of those either, so I don't pretend to be. So to sit in a courtroom and then listen to a judge talk about what's best for that child, they have no clue what's best, except that this child needs both parents unless it can be proven otherwise. And that's what the professionals are supposed to be involved for, to give real expert direction in that regard. And so that usually doesn't happen. Affidavits are not cross-examined. Anybody can write anything in an affidavit, and you show up in court with this affidavit, and I've heard judges say twice in different cases, I'm not prepared to read those affidavits. I couldn't believe that the judge said that. You know, you're paid to read the affidavit, paid very well. So how do you say you're not going to do it? Another judge said, I don't want to look at the history, I want to just move forward. Well, if you don't look at the history, how are you going to determine what the background in this case is that caused the alienation, or what exactly, is it estrangement, is it alienation, what's going on?
I think another problem with that is that in where I'm from in Lethbridge, every time you're in front of court in family chambers, you're in front of a different judge.
Mm-hmm.
So now in my case, going into 4 years now, we finally got one judge that said, I'm going to take a look at this. And I'm thinking, yeah, 3 years too late.
yeah.
But when you're in front of a different judge, because they don't read the affidavits, because they don't want to be bothered with that, I think another thing is because there's 50 or 70 things on their list, the court is so overwhelmed, and 90% of those, at least in Lethbridge, get adjourned, pushed to keep the billable hours up for the lawyers. You get lost in the shuffle.
Well, yeah. Well, we've been in it for 10 years.
In medicine,
Yeah.
so we have the
You know
same.
it.
We know, and we found.
We've got the
Even
same
when-
judges.
Yeah, but we also found that as soon as he started representing himself, we did better than paying for a lawyer, because we almost lost everything going through that process
Yeah.
until we went this way.
And that's the shift. I found a study that says that about 80% of divorces in Canada are self-represented.
Yeah,
And
there's
that
a
seems to be in
reason.
with your research as well. When you represent yourself, in my case, I can now stand in front of the judge and give my story instead of trusting that my lawyer at $500 an hour
Yeah.
is going to adequately bring my point across, which he doesn't. So,
Ideally, if it could be taken out of the court system altogether, I think it would be in everyone's best interest. And so the way I finished off, they're talking about the default shared parenting. If it just went to a triage system where you had mental health professionals who act as case managers, and they actually know this stuff, and they know about personality disorders, and reward and punishment systems in family dynamics, then they would act as the monitors, and they would sort of oversee the direction of these children until adulthood. And they would be paid by the case. They would not be paid by the hour. Mm-hmm. And that way, if we could keep it out of the courts, there would be a big disincentive to prolong these cases, and that would be a big step forward. You know, so far, there is a lot of backlash from family law because it doesn't want to go in that direction.
It doesn't want to do it. I've heard from at least a dozen men that they pretty much spend all their money, start self-repping, and at that time they also realize that it's the law business. It's the flow of money is what it is.
Sure.
It's not protecting the kids or being righteous, or it's a business, like you had in your slide, right?
Sure.
Sorry for being late. I don't know if it was covered already or not. What I've heard so far from everyone, it so closely resonates with what happened to my life in the last 6 months. That started with the EP order. So the way the EP order came down, based on all of these lies that was put up there, and 2 cops showed up with that notice, and I wasn't expecting that, so I asked them, what is it about? I thought it was like a warrant or something. And they said, this is the EP order. So I didn't know what EP order was, so they told me what this stands for. Okay, good. So I said, well, I didn't do anything. why am I charged with this? And they go, well, we are not supposed to listen to you or something, and you have to go to the court, whatever you have to say. And maybe I watched too many law movies or B-grade Hollywood stuff movies, where I always thought that I would at least be given a chance to make a call to the lawyer, and that's exactly what I say. Can I please make a phone call? And they said no. So, and they said you have 10 minutes to pack up. So, which I reluctantly did, and then I left. It took about 4 or 5 days just to get a court date in paper, but then the court system is supposed to release the transcript to the court doc lawyer. What they say is supposed to assist you, and my appointed court doc lawyer didn't get the transcripts in time, so it was adjourned for another more than a week or so. So ultimately it was about 2 weeks later when I first even got a chance to submit my affidavit, where I clearly mentioned that nothing of the allegations that my ex mentioned it took place. It was all lies. And at that point in the court, I was expecting the judge or the ex's lawyer to cross-examine me. And nothing of that sort happened. Like nothing happened, no questioning, nothing. And my ex demanded the EPO be extended for 1 year. And my court-appointed doc lawyer was suggesting 1 month, and the ex's lawyer wasn't happy, so she said, well, it's too short a time. The judge said, well, what would be acceptable? And she said, yeah, 2 months. No, this just mentioned 2 months, and they both agreed. And my court-appointed lawyer didn't even check with me if 2 months is okay with me or not, because even 1 month is not acceptable to me. So that was done. And when I checked back with the lawyer, like, what is the remedy? I'm not happy, like, not to be able to see my kids for 2 months for something that I never did. And he said, well, the only way you could do is go through the appeal system, and you're looking at minimum of 10 months to a year, and for the expense to be at least 10,000 plus. And I said, well, that was my motivation to, see if I could cancel it, as my daughter's and son's birthday are within that 2-month period, so I won't be able to see them. So when I heard that, this is the expense that I have to be ready to bear, I said, I cannot afford the money side, and also the time. Like, my EPO was expiring in, at that point, I think it's about, from the day one, it's about 3 months. So waiting for 10 to 12 months and $10,000+ is not a better option than what they gave me now. So I reluctantly went with it. The EPO ended, and then I tried to work with the Resolution Center at the 7th floor, but my ex didn't support that. So to tell a long story short, it was a disappointment with the system, the legal system, and also the fact that there are some conditions that come as prerequisites for the resolution service to work. One is that one of your kid has to be less than 15 years or something, which was okay for my case. My daughter was 13 at the time. And the other one was one of the spousal partner has to make less than 40K, which was okay for my ex too. But the problem is both parties has to agree. And if one party says no, which my ex did, there is no legal authority on the court to make it work. And to make matter worse, she was allowed to have legal aid because of her lower income, and I was not. So I checked legal guidance, legal aid, some pro bono lawyer community, you name it. I went through the entire cycle. There was no one. Other than once a month, if you're lucky to get these pro bono lawyers when they come down to the community centers. So you just have to, take your chances and be in the queue. So other than that, that's about it. So she got a lawyer now, and I cannot afford a lawyer, so I'm self-representing. And the pressure is mounting on me. Regarding the psychological assessment, it actually was initiated by me because I was alienated and I was suffering. My psychiatrist officially diagnosed me that I'm suffering from depression, and I actually gave a copy of that letter to the judge. And in the third court hearing, I requested the judge that, I'm very much suffering for not being able to see my daughter for 2+ months now. My psychiatrist mentioned that he would support any kind of joint family therapy session. I think I used the word counseling when I was telling the judge. And the judge said, she went through my court documents before, and she said, that was a different judge. And she said, somehow it was missed. We should have, she acknowledged that it should have been done, that a child counselor be appointed for my daughter. And then she gave the formal directive. And the child's lawyer, that was another process, like 1+ month waiting process. I was expecting, and she even said that she would interview me, along with my daughter's teachers, friends, family doctors, etc. But at the end, she never interviewed me. She made up her mind, whatever she thought should be the case, and basically, I'm at their mercy now. In terms of if my daughter doesn't want to see me, I don't have any legal or any sort of authority, so I'm at their mercy. And I think if, like what you were suggesting, that if the psychologists or psychiatrists, that mental health professionals be allowed earlier in the system, right from the get-go, I think that would have been more productive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the system benefits the alienator, and they know that. And so it ramps up the situation every time, because your ex obviously knows what she can get away with.
I have a question. 2 years ago, my wife went into a clinic and said, I'm planning to kill myself and my children. And they kept her in a psych ward for a month, and she came out all medicated with plans to get better. But she didn't quite, and there was, she would make Facebook posts about worrying that she might kill our kids and stuff like this. So eventually, one day I called the cops when she was looking for guns. And I don't know what mechanism there is to get her medical charts into this process. My kids she went to Salt Spring Island because an Alberta judge ordered them out there. So now I can go visit them on Salt Spring Island, but I think they're in immediate risk and long-term risk because she's not healthy mentally by any stretch. And I don't know how to interject psychological assessment into this process. And because she'll say, no, you can't have my medical records. Her lawyer will say, no, you can't have her medical records. And even it's surprising to me that her own words on Facebook were part of my affidavits, and the system did what it did without any psychological oversight. And I feel like shocked that there's not a mechanism to drag a mandatory psychological assessment into this. And what more do? You phone the police, you hire lawyers, you go to court. Everything I've done has stopped her medical records from getting involved, and she can promise the judge till she's blue in the face that she'll go to counseling or whatever, but it's not something that she actually ever does. And there's no, I don't know of any mechanism to ensure that is being looked at. And parental alienation is a big factor, but actually there's more immediate concerns. So
How old are your children?
9, 7, 5, and 3.
And does she have sole custody?
She was never granted sole custody. It was without prejudice, but effectively she does, because
Day-to-day care.
the kids are going to school in Salt Spring Island, and I work in Calgary. So whenever I can fly out there and get them for a few days, I do. But
Yeah, it's very difficult, and of course they're with an ill parent for the vast majority of their time as well.
it's gonna ruin them. So
Yeah, you know, sorry to bring up my case again, but it was very similar because my ex-husband's, well, my now ex-husband, the alienated dad, his ex was also a psychiatric patient, and so not only were her records held, and we never saw them, and they were never brought to court, but she also took the 3 daughters to that same psychiatrist, and they were on antidepressants and antipsychotics at the same time. And that, which should never happen, and also we never found out why. And I think it was because
she's
the girls.
trying to get my kids medicated for things they don't have. And
Yeah.
there's lots of other issues.
So I don't know, Dan, if you can comment on that. I'm just wondering because the legal system will not help, guaranteed, right? The more you pay into it, it's a hamster wheel, and it won't help you. So I'm just wondering, is there a way to seize psychiatric records?
It's very, very difficult. Right? I mean, they're locked up pretty tight. The court can make a request. The best usually you'll get, unless they spend a lot of time and money and they don't want to do that, right, will be to have the psychiatrist write up a brief of some kind, but to get the actual records would be very difficult.
Can family services access it better?
What's that?
Can family services access the records easier
Not
than say?
interprovincially.
No.
And these,
Because that's been,
they
we've
certainly
done
can't
better through them.
interprovincially. So they say, well, where are the kids? BC, okay, so I can have social services go talk to them and look at their BC medical records, but they're
They
not.
don't talk between Alberta and BC.
Yeah.
Well, there is, I think it's called Section 8, where you get it has to go through the court. So basically you're now going in and through this, I think it's called Section 8. And you gotta basically claim that your kids are in harm of the other parent, and you have to give just reasons for it. And through that, the court then can, and only then, can they then ask for an evaluation, and the evaluation has to be on both parents. And it's a $50,000 sort of, takes about a year to go through.
Yeah.
But until you get that evaluation done, the courts won't force any one of the parents to do anything in the way of getting psychological help because they're over 18, and the courts don't have that authority.
To force people into
Yeah.
assessment. Yeah.
Right?
And how many people have $50,000 with maybe winning, right? That's the other
The
factor.
problem seems to be it's the no that always wins. You have one parent who's willing to do that, and I would hazard to guess that most of us in the room are the targeted parents.
Yeah.
So we're willing to do whatever it takes to get help, access, time with our kids, and the no on the other side stops it dead in its tracks.
Yeah, so
And
you'll
the
get the
system-
assessment and the alienator won't.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we'll
exactly.
say, we'll suggest it, we'll pay for it, we'll take the time, we'll put whatever effort it is
Yeah.
to get it done, met with a no, and the judge says, oh, okay, well, there's a no, which you'd think in rational thought should be the first clue that something's wrong.
Yeah.
Right. So I just, as of 2 weeks ago, I actually had a conversation with the assistant director of family services, or now child services, and based on that same thing, their analysis would be that's an unhealthy parent. And we're going, great, now you've analyzed it, it's an unhealthy parent, do something.
Right.
And their reasoning was, and they actually put it in writing, was, well, if we deal with it, are you willing to deal with consequences of what could happen to the kids?
Because they actually said that they
No
recognize
way.
there's a problem, but if they go in the house, it might actually make the situation worse for the children. And are we willing to do it? And they're not willing to do it. They're willing to go like this and not touch
Okay,
the
so you're
situation.
gonna leave them in an abusive situation instead of, it's the cult, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole cult mentality.
Yeah.
You don't take somebody out of a cult every other weekend and Wednesdays
Yeah.
and then put them back into the cult 90% of the time and then say they're fixed.
Yeah.
You have to, so they recognize it, but they still
We
don't
have
Well, they recognize
documentation
it.
That's
of
criminal.
the yin yang, and they won't.
Well, they
do it.
recognize it, that there's an issue,
Yeah.
but their system is one that they don't recommend
Step
for the resolution. Because their system and how they would resolve it is take away the kids. And they're saying, but
Which
you want to
should
have
happen.
both parents. And the thing, I'm going, yes, both parents, if they're healthy, should have access to the kids.
Right.
Well, their system is basically either we rip them out or we don't do anything.
But wouldn't the kids
But they ask you a
potentially-
question, that's impossible.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. But,
Do you,
and can they
if
not
we
have
do
the
this, it'll cause
authority-
more harm to the kids. Do you want us to go ahead? And if you say yes, then you're a parent who wants to cause harm to your kids, right?
Yeah.
And
So
if you
you're
say
caught.
no,
It's a no-win double bind. You're caught.
it's your caught in a double bind.
And you would think they would
Then
have
we're
the
the aggressive
authority
parent.
to get analysis on the mom and turn around and actually do treatment, or it's probably in this case, I mean, we're pretty sure narcissistic and enmeshment and the whole thing. So if there was an analysis on mom, then both children should be removed anyways for the health of the children. But they don't even want to touch it because they're scared.
To take responsibility. Right.
But again, there are, it's not acceptable anymore for courts to say, well, we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Because there actually are some cases where it has been recognized that this is the cult of alienation, and the children are removed and put in the other parent's care, interim custody, while they do the assessment on the alienator. And so that's what has to happen, because
Is there
as Jim said, that's exactly true. Like,
Is there a
yeah,
case law I can point to where this case happened and while they're assessing the alienator, they put the kids with the non-alienator?
yeah, for sure. Email me, or we can talk anyway, and I'll see what I can find. But I know there have been a couple recently in Ontario where that's the case, and so because when it's a bona fide alienation case, it is a cult. And so, as Jim said, you have to remove the children 100%. And so you can't do an assessment while the children are still in a dangerous context.
It doesn't work.
And so the minute that your ex finds out that somebody's going to do an assessment on her, your children would be in danger. And that should not be on your shoulders. And therefore, if the courts were doing their job, they would have the kids apprehended first, given to you while this is being done with your ex. So hopefully that kind of idea, getting people to understand that it is a cult, is really difficult. And again, the courts are way behind. They're never going to be helpful. It has to be upfront right away when you're not seeing kids in a calm joint parenting kind of situation right away. Then there's a problem there, and it could easily turn into alienation. And so, yeah, I mean, I wish I could say more about what you need to do. I don't know, right? That's the problem, is that the legal system is a disaster. And the really sad thing is, before I ever got involved, if somebody had told me, especially dads, because it's more often dads that are alienated, if they said, my ex-wife is a control freak and she's taken over the kids, but I'm just going to leave it alone because there's no point in using the law, I would have thought, you're a weakling, how dare you, you don't love your kids. And now I think the exact opposite. And so I'm not saying that you should walk away, but I think that there are lawyers that will tell you that too. Lawyers will say, well, you know what, you might go get a consultation with a lawyer, and that lawyer will probably rightfully say, if he or she is ethical, they'll say, you know what, we can't help you. And that's the sad truth. They can't. And so there has to be an intervention that maybe does come through social services. Somehow you go at it from a more criminal angle as opposed to custody. Because it is criminal. These kids are at risk.
When you did your study and you had the 28 families, was there any sort of notice that it was like a second generation or third generation sort of reoccurrence?
Oh yeah.
Like there was a cycle happening right from family to family to family.
Yeah. It continues.
Yeah.
Just like any other cycle of abuse.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's really not that surprising when you think about it.
So would narcissism then be a taught behavior, or?
Yes.
Well, there's talk now about it being a little bit of both. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the ACEs research, the Adverse Childhood Experience research, and that, adverse childhood experiences accumulate with time and make you less functional in adulthood. So if you came from a history of neglect and abuse, you are more likely to become a narcissist because your own attachment was disrupted early on. And so that we know now that that's a big reason why narcissists are narcissists. And so whether it's entirely genetic, I don't know what you think about this, but you know, it may always be a combination.
It's always
nature
both.
nurture.
That's how I come down on the nature nurture, right? Yeah. It's always both ends.
There's a lady here in Calgary that we've utilized quite a bit, and she was a social worker. We've introduced you to her. She was a social worker for many, many years, and then when she retired, she planned to go just do her own thing and discovered there's an awful lot of this going on. So she's actually started her own practice to help, and we've utilized her quite a bit. We haven't found court very useful. We've actually gone through family services at every level you can imagine and still have it in front of family services, and probably had more movement because of that. But she has helped us understand wording to fight it through family services. So
That's a great resource to share.
she has been, so we can share it around.
Share that resource, yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Because she's been probably, you know, trying to
She'll
have
be
the
at
right wording, and she'll be at the
December
one
2nd.
December 2nd.
Okay.
So we are at our time, because they do come in and kick us out at 3:30 and we have to pack up. So thanks for coming, and on behalf of the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, we really want to thank Dr. Chris. She did a wonderful job, informative, expertise. Thanks so much.
We'll see you all hopefully on December 2nd.
Yeah. For dads, moms, and kids, you have the flyer, right?
Yeah, and in the meantime, you know, like I think really talking to each other is really helpful, because what you're saying is, because that's one thing I can't really help with, you know, because I don't know where to go instead. All I can really say is the legal system will fail you, which is really horrible to say, but it's almost always the case.
That's almost always the case. Yeah.
Well, on sort of my working sort of aspect with CAFE and that is really trying to get all the stories and all the data that comes behind it. So the data that you have about the 28 families and that is huge as we try to move forward and try to make the changes, because we have to show facts and we have to show, you know, a due course of, this is repetitive, right? There is a systematic type of thing that's happening over and over and over, and we're just not addressing it, or the system's not addressing it, right? So.
It took a long time to get people to pay attention to residential schools.
Yes.
You know, so we don't want to wait another few decades.
No, we don't.
And so it's so much about communication.
Why don't you take 1 minute or 30 seconds and tell us about the new film documentary that you almost got wrapped up? Because that might speak to a lot of what our questions are.
Well, the film is called Erasing Family. And so the director is Ginger Gentile. She's going to be in Calgary, and she's in Edmonton right now. But this is an international film to show how rampant this is worldwide. And I think she's using evidence from 5 different countries, which will be great. And so the awareness piece, that should raise it quite a bit, I hope. And so that'll be coming out next year. It's the film, from what I understand, because I'm kind of like I'm involved in the content to some degree, but she's kind of putting the threads together. And I know that her emphasis is on the children, because she thinks she's an alienated child herself who's now an adult. And so she really believes that the way to turn this thing around is to get adult children talking about what happened to them. And to say this was not okay. I was abused for years. My society chose to ignore it. And you know, one of these days, maybe one of these adult children is going to sue the government, and it's maybe going to go to the Supreme Court, and maybe that's what has to happen to open the floodgates. I mean, that's what did happen with the residential schools. So I think the greater awareness, the better. And you know, I think too, right back to the beginning before we started officially, there was some talk about, you know, feeling isolated in the beginning, and that might have happened to you. Like when this first happened to you and you're served with an EPO and you lose your kids, you're thinking, maybe I am a bad person. Like what I don't even know what I did. You're so shell-shocked. And so talking to each other and finding out who has had this happen to them is really enlightening, because I guarantee there are other people you know, not just us in the room, but members of your family that this has happened to as well. Because once I got involved in it, I couldn't believe it, and now I can name at least 4 other members of my family, 2 siblings and a parent, and you know that this also happened to, but I didn't know what it was then. And so I think the more we talk about it and the more we bring it to the surface, then we'll start to realize how huge
the more
it is.
circles and the more conversations. Every person In our support groups or meet-up general groups, everyone that I've talked to, and there's dozens of them now, say, wow, I'm so happy I'm not alone. It's not just me. And that's what happens is you get isolated and you're alone, and then a whole other set of problems opens up for you, and despair, right? So we do have to wrap, sorry. We can talk out there a little bit.
Yeah, I can hang around if...
But yeah, Chris will hang around.